Welcome to Storytelling and Beyond for a new motivational story. Let's enjoy the story. The automatic door slid open with a soft chime, barely noticeable over the quiet murmur of the late-night convenience store. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a pale glow over the shelves stacked with snacks, bottled drinks, and everyday essentials. A few weary customers stood in line, waiting to purchase their items, their minds preoccupied with mundane worries. No one paid much attention when the small figure slipped inside. He was just a boy, thin, barely past his childhood years, with oversized clothes that hung loosely on his frame. His hoodie was pulled up over his head, partially shadowing his young face, but his eyes burned with an intensity far too heavy for someone his age. His small fingers trembled slightly as they gripped the handle of a plastic toy sword, the kind found in dollar stores or gifted to children who still believed in knights and heroes. But there was no playfulness in his stance, no childlike innocence in his trembling breath. This wasn't a game. The cashier, a middle-aged man with graying hair, barely looked up as the boy approached the counter. His fingers tapped absent-mindedly against the register, waiting for the next transaction. But the moment he heard the boy's voice, small yet strained, shaking yet determined, he froze. I need the money in the register," the boy stammered, his voice cracking. His grip tightened around the plastic sword, but even in his attempt at bravery, his knuckles were white with fear. A hush fell over the store. The other customers turned, eyes widening in disbelief. A few shifted nervously, stepping back. The boy swallowed hard. His heart pounded so violently in his chest that he thought it might burst. But he couldn't stop now. He had to be strong. He had to do this. "My grandma," he hesitated, his throat tightening. "She needs her medicine. I don't have enough. Please, just give me the money." His voice wavered, but his feet remained planted. The cashier's hand hovered near the register, but he didn't reach for the money. Instead, he studied the boy's face, the way his lip quivered, the way his fingers twitched around the toy sword. He wasn't a thief. He wasn't a criminal. He was just desperate. Tears burned at the corners of the boy's eyes, but he blinked them away. He couldn't cry. Not now. He had spent the last 2 days watching his grandmother grow weaker, her breathing ragged, her body frail. He had searched every corner of their small apartment, counting coins, hoping, praying that he had enough. But when he had reached the pharmacy, his heart had shattered. It wasn't enough. He had begged the pharmacist, pleaded with them to give him the medicine now and let him pay later. But rules were rules, they had said. No money, no medicine. And so, he had come here. Not because he wanted to. Not because it was right. But because it was the only thing he could think of. The customers in the store didn't know what to do. Some of them looked away, uncomfortable. Others glanced at each other, waiting for someone to act. But no one moved. The boy's breathing grew heavier. The weight of the moment pressed down on his small shoulders, threatening to crush him. He could feel his courage unraveling, could feel the tears threatening to spill. Had he made a mistake? Would they call the police? Would his grandmother die because he had failed? The air felt thick, suffocating. The fluorescent lights hummed above him, the buzzing sound amplifying the silence. And then, just as his fingers loosened around the plastic sword, just as his vision blurred with helplessness, the store manager walked in. And in that instant, everything changed. The quiet jingle of keys and the slow creak of the office door barely registered at first. The boy was too wrapped up in his pounding heartbeat, in the weight of terrified eyes staring at him from every corner of the store. But then, a single pair of footsteps. Measured. Steady. Purposeful. Something in the air shifted. The store manager had arrived. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and serious, his neatly pressed uniform a stark contrast to the chaos unfolding before him. His presence alone commanded attention, a quiet authority that made even the flickering store lights seem to pause. His name tag glinted under the artificial glow, Robert. Robert's sharp eyes flicked across the scene, the trembling boy, the plastic sword clutched too tightly in his small hands, the frozen cashier, the silent, wide-eyed customers. He took in every detail in an instant, and yet, as his gaze finally settled on the boy, something in his expression softened. The boy, caught between fear and desperation, tightened his grip on the sword. His hands were sweating now, the plastic slick beneath his trembling fingers. His breath hitched as he locked eyes with the manager. This was it. This was the moment everything would come crashing down. Would Robert yell? Call the police? Drag him out by the collar like he had seen happen to others who had stolen out of hunger or despair? His stomach twisted. If they took him away, if they made him leave now, his grandmother. He couldn't finish the thought. The weight of it was unbearable. Robert took a slow step forward. The boy flinched. Another step. The customers in the store seemed to shrink away, instinctively stepping back, as if anticipating an explosion. But Robert's expression remained unreadable, his movements controlled. The boy's voice broke as he spoke again, his words barely a whisper now. I just need money for her medicine. Silence. Robert's brows furrowed, his gaze searching the boy's face. The flickering light above the register cast shadows under the boy's hollowed eyes, accentuating the exhaustion, the fear, the quiet resignation of someone who had been fighting a battle far too big for his small frame. Robert didn't speak right away. He simply looked. And in that pause, in that heartbeat of quiet between them, the boy felt something strange, something unexpected. Not judgment. Not anger. Not even pity. Understanding. The plastic sword trembled in the boy's grasp. His arms ached from holding it up, his entire body rigid with the effort of forcing himself to stand his ground. But in that moment, it felt pointless. Because the man in front of him wasn't looking at him like a criminal. He was looking at him like a human being. A boy. A scared, desperate boy. The weight of everything, the long days of hunger, the sleepless nights of worry, the hopelessness pressing in on all sides, suddenly became too much. His vision blurred. His fingers loosened. And then, the sword slipped from his hands. A hollow clatter echoed through the store as it hit the tile floor, its bright red plastic catching the light as it spun to a stop. The boy didn't move. He had nothing left to hold on to. The boy's hands hung limply at his sides, his breathing ragged, his chest rising and falling in uneven gasps. The plastic sword lay abandoned on the floor between him and the manager, its bright, toy-like color now looking absurd against the heavy reality of the moment. The store was silent. No one moved. No one spoke. The weight of everything, the fear, the shame, the helplessness, settled into the boy's bones. He had fought so hard to be strong, to stand his ground, to do something, anything, to save his grandmother. But now, with nothing left to hold on to, with no plan, no way forward, no escape, he just stood there. His fists clenched. He waited for the yelling. For the call to the police. For the cold, unforgiving consequences that always seemed to follow him no matter how hard he tried to do the right thing. But then, Robert, the store manager, knelt down. Not in aggression. Not to restrain him. Just to pick up the sword. The boy's breath hitched as he watched the man's hands, large, steady, roughened by years of work, wrap around the cheap plastic handle. Robert turned it over in his grip, studying it as if it were something meaningful, something worth noticing. And then, with a quiet sigh, he stood. Slowly. Deliberately. He didn't brandish the sword. He didn't hold it up like evidence of a crime. Instead, he placed it gently on the counter. His movements were calm, careful, like he was handling something fragile. And then he looked at the boy. His eyes weren't angry. They weren't cold. They were patient. The boy felt his throat tighten, his vision swimming. Why wasn't Robert yelling? Why wasn't he calling for someone to grab him? Why wasn't he treating him like a thief, like a problem to be dealt with? The uncertainty of it made the boy's hands tremble. Robert exhaled slowly, his voice even, measured. What's your grandmother's name? The question caught the boy off guard. His mouth opened, but no words came. His mind had braced for confrontation, for punishment. He wasn't prepared for kindness. The boy swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. Margaret. Robert nodded, like the name meant something. Like it mattered. What medicine does she need? The boy blinked rapidly. He hadn't expected this. He had imagined every other possibility: running, fighting, getting thrown out onto the street. But he hadn't imagined someone listening. His lips parted, and this time, when he spoke, the words came without force. She has trouble breathing. The doctor gave her a prescription, but we don't have the money. I tried everything. His voice cracked, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't try to stop it. I didn't know what else to do. Robert's gaze never wavered. He wasn't looking through him. He wasn't looking past him. He was seeing him. Hearing him. Understanding him. And then, in that quiet, steady voice, Robert said something the boy never expected to hear. Let's get her the medicine. The boy's breath caught. His legs nearly buckled. He had walked into. Tears burned at the edges of the boy's eyes as he watched Robert turn and walk toward the pharmacy section of the store. His legs felt unsteady, his breath uneven, his mind struggling to grasp what had just happened. For the first time in what felt like forever, someone was helping him. Not lecturing him. Not pushing him away. Not punishing him for being desperate. Helping. The employees, the customers, everyone who had been frozen in shock just moments ago, watched in stunned silence as Robert calmly approached the pharmacy counter. The boy couldn't move, couldn't speak. His entire world had been chaos, a storm he couldn't escape. And now, suddenly, everything had slowed down. The store's pharmacist, an older woman with kind eyes and graying hair, looked up as Robert approached. She had been watching everything unfold from behind the counter, her expression unreadable. But when Robert handed her the crumpled prescription paper that the boy had pulled from his pocket, something softened in her gaze. She looked past Robert, straight at the boy. He lowered his head instinctively, shame creeping up his neck. He had caused a scene. He had embarrassed himself. He had. Margaret, right? The pharmacist's voice was gentle. The boy lifted his head, hesitant. He nodded. She scanned the prescription, her fingers moving over the keyboard as she searched the system. This medication, it's for her breathing issues? Another nod. The woman hummed softly, then turned to Robert. We have it in stock. Robert didn't hesitate. Put it on my account. The words sent a shockwave through the boy's chest. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might burst. He stepped forward, shaking his head, his voice cracking. I can't let you do that. Robert turned to him, his expression unwavering. You're not letting me do anything. I'm choosing to. The boy's hands clenched into fists, not in anger, but in sheer overwhelm. No one had ever done something like this for him. No one had ever looked at him and seen more than a kid from a broken home, struggling to keep his family together. It didn't make sense. People didn't just do this. I don't understand. His voice was barely above a whisper, his throat tight. Why are you helping me? Robert studied him for a moment, then sighed, his gaze distant, like he was looking at something far away. Or maybe someone from his past. Because once, Robert said softly, I was you. The boy's breath hitched. Before he could say anything else, the pharmacist returned with a small brown bag and placed it gently into his hands. The weight of it was light. But to the boy, it felt like the entire world.